Robinson was elected to the Manitoba legislature in 1993. That he would succeed in a total of 5 elections and spend 16 years as a cabinet minister, as well as being named deputy premier of the province. These are pretty impressive achievements for anyone. For Eric Robinson, a member of Manitoba's Cross Lake First Nation, each of these was a victory over incredible odds. Eric Robinson was born in Manitoba's far north in Norway House. He was taken from his family and placed in residential school at just 5 years of age, and he remained there until he was 9. The suffering of children in these schools is now well known, and he experienced most of it. The memories are still painful, but he chooses to believe that the experience helped to prepare him for the challenges of a public life.
When you're in residential school, you have to be a survivor to survive the beatings and some of the negative things that did occur to us as children, at the hands of priests and nuns. So you're always you always had to have your back not turned too much, and you had to be on your feet. You had to think. You had to, and also be prepared for the consequences. If you did something wrong, if you happened to speak your language, you had to be prepared for the consequences. So that those survival skills kicked in. So I think that with that background, it gave me a bit of an edge. I certainly wasn't scared of authority, and I thought the beatings only hurt for so long, and I took the best punches that the priests and the brothers and the nuns could throw. So I thought, I could survive, So I wasn't afraid of that kind of authority. I never was, and I learned how certain survival skills, I suppose, and I was able to be able to use those skills, into my adulthood as a younger man, and then leaving home early, doing different things, even venturing into journalism, doing different things, advocacy work, doing some work that was viewed as being radical and not normal, and then getting into the political world.
Eric Robinson had a gift for communication, and after some time spent in jobs as varied as being a dishwasher and a disc jockey, he found a place for himself in media, working for both the CBC and for NCI, Native Communications Incorporated. His awareness of desperate conditions for First Nations people grew, and he began talking with the elders he knew about the wisdom of becoming part of white government.
First of all, nobody really took me seriously that I would ever become elected, because I wasn't one of those real serious people, as a young man. I was viewed more on the outside as being a little more radical in my views, the Red Power type Indian person, I will say, back in those days. But I didn't really have a strong interest to become engaged in the mainstream political system. I was more inclined towards journalism and how we could become more better heard, I suppose. I look back to Brunelda Wheeler, who was the host of Our Native Land.
This is Our Native Land. Hello, my name is Brunelda Wheeler.
And I viewed her as one of my role models, because she was tremendously gifted in communicating some of the First Nations activities that were going on across Canada through the reporters that she had throughout Canada. And they weren't necessarily Indigenous peoples, but certainly the ones that fed the show information. And it was a weekly show, a weekly 1-hour show, I think, brought Canada together. And I think that's sometimes overlooked. And then, of course, I was involved with the CBC Northern Service, where Inuktitut and Cree, Dene, and those other languages were prominent in the Northern Service of the CBC. So I was a part of that movement. So I thought communications was an important tool, and television came to be. And then, of course, in the modern world, we have social media, which has really taken off, and has really, I would say, the mainstream media to the side, because I think that for the most part we get our information now from social media as opposed to the mainstream media system. So we have a changing and evolving world.
Community elders, as well as his father, advised him that whatever he did, he needed to hang on to his language and to the understanding of ceremony. He wasn't really ready to hear them.
But of course, I didn't listen in a lot of cases either, because I was drinking by the time I was 12 years old. I was sleeping under bridges in Seattle, Washington. In my late teens, I was getting into trouble. I was drinking, fighting, and you name it. And at the age of 22, I became sober and drug-free. And I'm one of the lucky ones in a lot of ways, having, ventured into that lifestyle. I was lucky to get out of it at an early age. I went and drowned that out, that hurt and that pain, for a long period of time. And then I turned that into another more positive form in advocating and advancing the issues of Indigenous peoples.
Eric Robinson's own broken childhood, as well as the rise of what some were calling Red Power, compelled him to keep working with Manitoba's Native organizations. In 1985, he'd co-authored a book with Henry Bird Quinney called Infested Blanket, a history of brutal abuses suffered by First Nations communities in Canada. It was an important book, and it made him one of those reluctant to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday.
I'm one of those too that questions, what the heck have we got to celebrate? 150 years of assimilation attempts on a people? We don't have much to celebrate. So I'm one of those people. But I want to see our young people be more assertive. I would like them to be a little more, I don't want to see them killed, fighting for Mother Earth, or, but doing things in a proper way, and through being the voices in Parliament, the voices in legislatures, in city councils across this country, or even in the courts. Our young people, that's what I have hope for in a time to come.
When a by-election opened up in the northern Manitoba riding of Rupert's Land in '93, Eric Robinson ran for the New Democrats, and he won. By then, he was determined that he could serve both government responsibilities and his passion for improving Indigenous life. Under Premier Gary Doer, he took on some of the province's biggest jobs in Aboriginal and Northern affairs, economic development, as well as culture, heritage, and sport. He brought his unique perspectives and his personal Indigenous advocacy to Manitoba's Legislative Assembly. His work on missing and murdered women in Manitoba began early in the 1990s, when little attention was being paid to it.
And I thought, where are the men leaders? Where are the male leaders? They're a part of this too. We're supposed to be the protectors. We're supposed to be this and that. So with the death of Helen Betty Osborne, and when finally somebody was convicted of her death in 1971, on November 13th of that year, I became involved with her family that she left behind, her late mom. She became a good friend, and I knew Betty Osborne when we were kids. I used to see her. I knew who she was. So we were able to bring together the killer that was eventually convicted of the crime of Betty Osborne's murder in 1971 and members of her family. And they were told by the person that was involved in her killing what happened. I was able to facilitate these things as an opposition MLA. So anybody that says you can't do anything as an MLA and be able to facilitate anything is totally wrong, because I was able to do it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. I started working with other residential school survivors. Little did they know that I went through similar things. The guys that are doing time in a penitentiary and working with them, and that work still carries on to this day, and it'll carry on as long as I have the strength, because I think it's very important. We need an advocate for our people, and I'll contribute in my own way, in my own small way.
He took a seat in the legislature in '93 when both politicians and the larger public were absorbing the report of the AJI, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. The AJI had exposed many unreasonable hardships imposed on First Nation citizens caught up in the justice system. He helped to find and tell the stories that otherwise may not have been heard.
I was at the advance worker. I worked in the prisons and got the guys ready, for the hearings. I traveled to the communities and told them what this commission was about, and prepared them. And before the commissioners came to their communities, we were all set up, and presenters talked about their dealings with the justice system, period. Whether it was in child welfare, whether it was being arrested, whether it was being treated, differently by police services, whether it be city or otherwise. So we heard a wide array of problems with respect to Aboriginal people and their dealings with the justice system. So I think that that served as a good starting point in Canada. And then, of course, beyond that, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples took off. And that was something that was also not taken seriously. And when we took office in 1999, Gordon McIntosh and I, in his new office as the Attorney General, found that the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry still wrapped in a cellophane paper. It was never opened by the previous government. So that was one of our first tasks. Was we went to work and started addressing on those areas that focused or related to the province of Manitoba. The province of Manitoba had something like 93 recommendations of the 294 recommendations made by the AGI that directly related to the province of Manitoba. The remainder were the City of Police, the City of Winnipeg Police, and also the federal government. So we've made slow progress there too.
He also had much to contribute to the issue now known as the 60s Scoop, an era stretching from the 1960s to the 80s, in which countless First Nations children were scooped up and placed in foster care or adoptive families, with no thought of their heritage or their emotional support.
I was trying to be helpful as an elected Indian leader prior to the mainstream political stuff, in bringing back some people that were taken away from Canada, taken away from their province, taken away from their community, placed in foreign environments, raised as non-native people, and come home, get reintroduced. And that's where the problems began, really, for a lot of them, because they were totally foreign, totally didn't know anything about themselves as Cree Indian people, as Ojibways, as Dakotas, because that was foreign to them. I mean, as a residential school survivor, it was tough enough for me uh, and for us that went there, but at least we had each other. But can you imagine being a little brown kid from a reserve in northern Manitoba, being raised in the southern United States, let's say in Louisiana or Mississippi or one of those states, and even worse, being an Indian kid from one of the northern communities and being raised in Holland or Germany or somewhere like that, and there's still some out there that we haven't even brought back. So that needs redress, and in a lot of ways, they had it worse than those of us that went to residential school, because at the very least we had each other. In their case, they had nobody to look to. They had nobody they could relate to, because everyone around them didn't look like them, and they didn't look like anybody else. So that to me is very hurtful, still to this day.
Working on the inside of government taught him that social progress is very slow and the required patience is very difficult.
Well, there's been a few good fights, I'll say that. It's like an old fighter. I would have to say that there's been a few worth getting bloodied over. I thought that, you know, allowing people to feel a sense of pride, the celebration of who we are. The Manitowoc Festival was a tremendous breakthrough, and I think that that was among the many things that we were able to do. I mean, we were busy all the time. Selinger and I, when he was premier, and Gary Dewar before that, being able to, I think that one that stands out as well is that we're able to get dialysis treatment facilities on a couple of reserves, something that was never done anywhere in Canada. And that made me feel good, because we made a breakthrough. We broke down some barriers, and because some argued that provinces have no business on reserves. Well, at election time, we're the first ones to say that Indians are Manitobans too. So let's prove that to be true. And that's when we moved to have the dialysis treatment facilities, because diabetes and kidney type problems are so prominent in the Aboriginal community that it had to be addressed. So we were able to do that in a couple of reserves, which prevented, in the cases of some anyway, not all, I wish I could say all, having to move to a foreign environment like Winnipeg, being disconnected from their families, the traditional way of eating, whether it's fish, wild meat, or anything of that nature, and then being thrown here, and sometimes they just died of loneliness. So, and doing things like that was really meaningful. So I'm very proud of a few things that we have done, in spite of the challenges.
One of his proudest projects has been the Manitowoc Festival, a powerful example of how people from different cultures can begin to get to know and appreciate each other just by sharing food, music, and dance.
We've been able to ensure, I think, to a large degree, the ongoing pride of Indigenous peoples through their culture, that they no longer have to hide it, that they don't have to pretend that they're not Indigenous people, as the case was once so common. And we created the Manitowoc Festival for all nations, which is really something that I just came to me, and then I called upon other people, artists and musicians, people like that, and solicited their thoughts, and together we built this together. It just came to me. And but the idea in its entirety is not mine. I can't take credit for that, because there are people like Errol Randall, Lisa Meaches, other people like that that were involved in that, that had their own thoughts, their own ideas, how we promote ourselves as Indigenous peoples through music, through the traditional activities, the trade fair, all these different kind of things, you know, the artistic side of things, if you will, and the promotion and to ensure the ongoing life of our way of life as Indigenous peoples is through that Manitowoc Festival. And this year it just celebrated its 10th anniversary. So I'm very proud that I was a very small part of that.
Looking back on his 23-year political career, Eric Robinson now cherishes the advice the elders in his community gave him a long time ago when he first considered entering public life.
If you wanna go be a liberal, go be a liberal. If you wanna go be a conservative, go ahead. If you want to be a New Democrat, fine. But don't forget who you are first and foremost. You are an Indigenous person. Your forefathers are committed to the land, the integrity of Mother Earth. That's first and foremost. Secondly, you can toe the party line all you like, but first and foremost, you can't forget who you are. And I think that knowing who you are as an Indigenous person, whether you're of Ojibwe, Dakota, Cree background, and never forgetting who you are, is what these old-timers passed on to me. You know, it helps you stand strong, I think, to a large degree, and it helps you be more determined, puts that fire in your belly, as they say. And it also gives you, I think, put you in a position of wanting to be a better fighter for your people. Not a dirty fighter, a good fighter.